The chess game on February 17, 1936, 3 months before Lucky Luciano's trial would begin, 4 months before his conviction would send him to Clinton prison for 30 to 50 years, different from all the others that Bumpy Johnson had played with Charles Lucky. Luciano in front of the YMCA on 135th Street. And the difference wasn't in the moves or the strategy or even the cold that made both men keep their hands in their coat pockets between turns, but in what Luciano said while staring at the board after Bumpy had just captured his queen with a knight fork that Lucky should have seen coming but hadn't, because his mind was clearly somewhere else entirely. "Bumpy," Luciano said quietly, speaking in the careful way people use when they're about to share information they've been holding too long. "I need to tell you something that can't leave this table. Something that, if it gets out, could destroy everything we built after Dutch went down. Something that makes me question whether I can trust anyone anymore. Even the people I love." They'd been playing chess regularly for 8 months since November 1935, 2 months after Lucky had ordered Dutch Schultz's assassination, when Schultz had ignored the Commission's directive not to kill prosecutor Thomas Dewey, since the historic meeting where Lucky and Bumpy had negotiated the arrangement that would let Harlem's black bookmakers maintain their independence as long as they paid tributes to the Genovese family's central gambling pools, since the deal that made Bumpy the undisputed godfather of Harlem and made Lucky the architect of organized crime's new structure where cooperation replaced constant warfare. The chess games weren't just recreation, they were diplomatic sessions where two leaders from different worlds maintained the delicate alliance that kept both their operations profitable and prevented the kind of bloodshed that had marked the early 1930s when Dutch Schultz had tried to muscle into Harlem and 40 people had died in the resulting war. Every move on the board reflected move S. In the real game they were playing together, where respect for boundaries and honoring agreements mattered more than either man's individual ambitions. But today, Lucky wasn't thinking about chess. He was thinking about betrayal. "It's gay," Lucky continued, using the nickname for Galina or the Russian-French ballerina, who'd been his girlfriend since 1929, who'd moved to New York specifically to find him after they'd met in Florida, who everyone in the mob world knew was Lucky's weakness, because he actually loved her in a way that men in their world weren't supposed to love anyone, who Lucky had explicitly refused to let testify during his upcoming trial because he didn't want her mixed up in this case, even though his lawyers thought her testimony could help him. Bumpy waited, understanding that whatever Lucky was about to reveal had been weighing on him heavily enough to risk sharing it with someone outside his immediate Italian circle, and sharing secrets across racial lines in New York required trust that few men possessed. "She's been talking to Dewey's people," Lucky said, still not looking up from the chessboard. "Not officially, not as witness. But she's been feeding them information about my operations' names, locations, how the bonding system works, which cops are on payroll. She thinks, I don't know. She thinks she's being careful, but I have people everywhere. Bumpy. I know when my own girlfriend is betraying me to the prosecutor who's trying to put me away for life. Have you ever been told a secret so dangerous that just knowing it made you complicit in whatever happened next, that required you to choose between honoring confidence and preventing disaster? That made you understand why some truths are better left unspoken, because speaking them forces actions that can't be undone. Subscribe to understand why the heaviest burden isn't always the secret itself, but the responsibility of knowing what to do with it. Bumpy considered the implications while studying the chessboard. If Gay Orlova was providing information to Thomas Dewey, even informally, she'd given prosecutors the intelligence they'd need to build their case against Lucky. The February 1st raids that had shut down dozens of brothels throughout Manhattan, the arrests of more than 100 people, mostly unable to post the extraordinary $10,000 bail. Dewey had convinced judges to impose the testimony that prosecutors were extracting from desperate prostitutes and madams who faced years in prison, unless they cooperated. All of that might have been possible because Lucky's girlfriend had told Dewey's investigators where to look and what to look for. "Why are you telling me this?" Bumpy asked. Because in their world, information was currency, and sharing it meant expecting something in return or preventing something worse. "Because you're the only person I know who understands what it means to maintain balance," Lucky said, finally looking up from the board. "You know what happens if I move against her publicly, if I have her killed, or even if I just cut her off and she realizes I know about her betrayal, she panic. She'll go directly to Dewey and offer to testify, officially. And whatever information she's been giving them quietly will become public testimony that my own girlfriend was my accuser. That destroys my defense completely. Makes me look like the kind of man who even the woman who loves him thinks is guilty. And if you do nothing? Bumpy asked. If I do nothing, she keeps betraying me while pretending to love me. And I have to watch the woman I actually care about help send me to prison while I act like everything's fine between us. And when I go to prison, 'cause let's be real, Bumpy, Dewey's got enough now, with or without her additional help. She's going to have to live with what she's done, knowing that she destroyed the only man who actually loved her back, rather than just used her for connections or appearances. This was the impossible calculation that leaders in criminal world faced constantly. How to respond to betrayal when both action and inaction carried consequences that could cascade into disasters affecting hundreds of people who depended on stability remaining intact. Lucky's trial was already scheduled for May. Dewey had already secured cooperation from multiple prostitutes and madams. The case was moving forward regardless of what Gay contributed. But if Lucky moved against her now, 3 months before trial, it could trigger exactly the kind of public testimony from scorned girlfriend that would guarantee his conviction rather than just make it likely. You want my advice? Bumpy asked. I want your promise, Lucky said. Promise that you won't tell anyone what I just told you. Not your people. Not Madame Queen. Not anyone. Because if this gets out, if word spreads that Lucky Luciano's girlfriend betrayed him, and he didn't kill her, then every punk in 5 families will think they can betray me too. But if I do kill her, she becomes martyr, and Dewey becomes avenging prosecutor, protecting innocent women from murderous gangster. Either way, I lose. So the only option is silence maintainee. The fiction that everything's fine while I go to trial, knowing my girlfriend helped build the case against me. Bumpy understood immediately why Lucky was trusting him with this, because Bumpy had no reason to spread this information, and every reason to keep it contained, because Bumpy's interests aligned with Lucky's interests in maintaining the fragile peace they'd negotiated after Dutch Schultz's death. Because if Lucky went to prison, on even stronger case than necessary, the Italian families might blame Bumpy for not preventing it, or might decide that Harlem deal wasn't worth honoring without Lucky personally guaranteeing it. You have my word, Bumpy said. This stays. Between us, nobody needs to know that your girlfriend betrayed you. Nobody needs to know that the great Lucky Luciano got taken down partly by a woman he loved. That's your burden to carry, not information that serves anyone else's purpose. They finished the chess game Lucky won, despite his distraction, because he was still better player than Bumpy even when his mind was elsewhere, and they never explicitly discussed Gay Orlova again. Though Bumpy watched from Harlem as the trial proceeded exactly as Lucky had predicted, Dewey's prosecutors produced witness after witness testifying to Lucky's control over prostitution racket. Lucky took the stand against his lawyer's advice and got destroyed by Dewey's cross-examination exposing his lies about income and phone records. The jury convicted him on 62 counts on June 7th, despite most journalists predicting acquittal, and Judge Philip McCook sentenced him to 30 to 50 years on June 18th, 1936. And throughout the trial, Gay Orlova never testified. She appeared in Dewey's office, once adorned in diamonds and fur, gushing about how infatuated she was with Lucky and how sinister he was, and prosecutors immediately realized she'd be disaster on witness stand because she was still too in love with him to convincingly portray him as villain. They didn't know that her love hadn't prevented her from betraying him quietly through pre-trial information sharing. They didn't know that her diamonds and furs had been bought with profits from the very prostitution ring she'd helped Dewey dismantle. They didn't know that the woman who seemed like Lucky's most loyal defender had been his most devastating betrayer. Only Lucky knew the complete truth, and Bumpy, who'd promised to take that truth to his grave. Comment below whether you would have kept that promise if you were Bumpy Johnson, whether protecting a criminal ally's secret shame matters more than exposing betrayer who destroyed him, whether silence about guilt is loyalty or complicity when the person you're protecting is already heading to prison for 30 to 50 years. Orlova was deported back to Europe after Lucky's conviction, not because authorities knew about her betrayal, but because her visa had been secured through sham marriage to theater usher she barely saw after meeting Lucky. And with Lucky imprisoned, that marriage's purpose was exposed, and immigration officials no longer had reason to let Russian-French dancer remain in United States. She went to Paris, the city she'd left years earlier to chase American dream that had turned into nightmare, where the man she loved went to prison, partly because of information she'd provided to prosecutor who'd promised her immunity she'd never actually needed because she was never going to be charged with anything. And then, sometime in the late 1940s, accounts vary on exact date, but everyone agrees on the basic facts: Orlova committed suicide. The official explanation was despair over failed attempts to find love with other men after Lucky, depression over exile from America, where she'd built life and career, inability to cope with aging as dancer whose physical beauty had been her primary currency in a world where youth mattered more than talent. Those explanations were all partially true. But Bumpy Johnson knew something that the obituary writers and the gossip columnists and even Gay's friends in Paris didn't know: that she'd killed herself, not just because of lost love, or faded beauty, or exile, but because she couldn't live with what she'd done. She'd betrayed the one man who'd actually loved her for reasons she probably couldn't even articulate clearly to herself. Maybe she'd been scared of his criminal life and thought cooperation with prosecutor would protect her. Maybe she'd resented being second priority to his business operations. Maybe she'd genuinely believed she was doing right thing by helping authorities stop prostitution ring, even if it meant destroying man she claimed to love. Maybe she'd been approached by Dewey's investigators when she was vulnerable, and they'd manipulated her into cooperation before she realized what she was doing. Whatever her reasons, she'd spent 10 years living with guilt that came from knowing she'd contributed to 30-50-year prison sentence for man who'd refused to let her testify during trial, specifically to protect her from being mixed up in this case. She'd spent decade watching Lucky age in prison while she tried to build new life that would never match what she'd had before, because everything afterward was tainted by knowledge of her own betrayal. She'd spent years unable to confess to anyone what she'd done, because confessing would mean admitting she'd been informant, and informants in mob world didn't live long enough to write confessions, even if they wanted to. So she'd carried that secret alone until it became unbearable. And then she'd ended it the only way that seemed to offer relief from guilt that wouldn't stop growing. Bumpy read about her death in newspaper that mentioned her connection to Luciano and her suicide in Paris, and he thought about the chess game 8 months before Lucky's trial, where Lucky had told him the truth about Gay's betrayal, and asked him to keep it secret. And he thought about how keeping that secret had meant watching Orlova live with guilt that eventually killed her, had meant knowing that she was destroying herself from inside, while everyone else thought she was just another aging showgirl unable to cope with ordinary disappointments. He could have told someone. He could have let word spread through mob networks that Gay had been informant, that her betrayal had contributed to Lucky's conviction, that her suicide was actually justice for a woman who'd turned on the man who loved her. That revelation would have changed her legacy from tragic romantic figure into cautionary tale about what happens to people who betray the mob, even when they think they're being careful, and even when they think their betrayal won't be discovered. But Bumpy had given his word to Lucky that the truth would stay between them. And in their world, your word was the only thing that mattered more than money, or power, or revenge. So Bumpy kept the secret. He let Orlova die with only her own conscience, knowing the full truth about why she couldn't live with herself. He let history remember her as Lucky Luciano's tragic girlfriend, rather than as the informant who'd helped send him to prison. And he carried that secret for 32 more years. The second time Bumpy Johnson thought seriously about Orlova's betrayal was in 1946, when news broke that Governor Thomas Dewey, the same prosecutor who'd sent Luciano to prison 10 years earlier, had commuted Lucky's sentence on condition that he be deported to Italy, and journalists were speculating about whether Lucky bribed his way out through wartime cooperation with naval intelligence, or whether Dewey had ulterior political motives for releasing the mob boss he'd built his career on convicting. Bumpy, who by 1946 had been running Harlem's operations for 11 years under the arrangement he and Lucky had negotiated in 1935, understood immediately what most people analyzing the commutation didn't: that Dewey releasing Lucky early wasn't about bribes or wartime services or political calculations, but about guilt. Thomas Dewey had built his entire prosecutorial career on the Lucky Luciano case. He'd been appointed special prosecutor specifically to take down mob boss who seemed untouchable. He'd won conviction that most journalists thought was impossible. He'd leveraged that victory into gubernatorial election and multiple presidential campaigns. Every success Dewey achieved in public life traced back to June 1936, when jury convicted Luciano on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. But Dewey also knew something that troubled him for 10 years, that his conviction had relied on testimony from desperate prostitutes and madams who'd been coerced into cooperation through impossibly high bail and threats of decades in prison. That his case had been built partly on information provided by women who loved the defendant and had betrayed him for reasons Dewey's investigators had never fully understood. That the greatest living gangster in America had gone to prison partly because his girlfriend had secretly undermined him while publicly appearing devoted. Dewey never knew that Lucky knew about Gay's betrayal. Dewey never knew that Gay's non-testimony at trial hadn't meant she was innocent of providing information. Dewey never knew that the woman who'd appeared in his office, infatuated with Lucky, had simultaneously been feeding his investigators intelligence that made February 1936 raids possible. But Dewey knew enough to understand that his conviction methods had been ethically questionable, even if they were technically legal. And 10 years of watching Lucky rot in prison while Dewey himself became governor had apparently created enough guilt that releasing Lucky early with plausible cover story about wartime cooperation seemed like appropriate penance. Bumpy recognized this pattern because he'd been watching it play out in Gay Orlova's self-destruction before her suicide. The weight of knowing you've betrayed someone, the inability to undo what you've done, the search for ways to mitigate damage you've caused while simultaneously maintaining public fiction that you're innocent of wrongdoing. Dewey commuting Lucky's sentence was Dewey's version of Gay's suicide, a desperate attempt to relieve guilt that had become unbearable, even though relief would never actually come because actions couldn't be undone and consequences couldn't be erased. The difference was that Dewey had power to do something concrete about his guilt, while Gay had only had power to end her own suffering. Dewey could release Lucky early and tell himself he'd corrected an injustice, even if the previous 10 years couldn't be restored. Gay could only stop existing and hope that death would bring peace that living had denied her. Subscribe for more stories about how secrets create cascading consequences that outlast the people who created them, how knowing the truth that others don't know becomes heavier over time rather than lighter, how promises to keep silence can mean watching people destroy themselves while you maintain fiction that you don't. Understand why they're suffering. When Lucky Luciano arrived in Italy in February 1946 after his deportation, Bumpy was one of the people he contacted through intermediaries to confirm that their Harlem arrangement would continue, even though Lucky was now operating from exile rather than from New York. The arrangement did continue. Frank Costello took over day-to-day operations of what would eventually be called the Genovese family, but Lucky remained as elder statesman whose authority still mattered, and Harlem's bookmakers continued paying tributes while maintaining independence. And the peace that Bumpy and Lucky had negotiated in 1935 lasted until Bumpy's death in 1968. But the conversation through intermediaries in 1946 also included message that Bumpy interpreted as Lucky checking whether Bumpy had kept the promise made during chess game 10 years earlier. Lucky wanted confirmation that nobody in Harlem had heard about Gay Orlova's betrayal, that her death had been mourned as tragedy rather than as justice for informant, that the secret they'd agreed to keep had actually stayed secret for an entire decade, while Lucky was in prison unable to verify whether Bumpy had honored his word. Bumpy sent back confirmation that yes, he'd kept the secret, that no, nobody in his organization knew what Gay had done, that yes, he would continue keeping it secret for as long as both of them lived, because a promise was a promise, regardless of whether the person who'd extracted it was in Dannemora prison or was now living in exile in Naples. That confirmation mattered because it told Lucky something important, that the alliance he'd built with Bumpy Johnson was based on more than just mutual profit or strategic convenience, was rooted in honor code that survived even when nobody else would ever know whether that code had been respected, was sustained by trust that couldn't be faked or purchased or enforced through threats because it depended entirely on both men choosing integrity, even when doing so served no immediate purpose. This was why their arrangement lasted 33 years from 1935 until Bumpy's death in 1968, longer than most mob alliances, longer than most legitimate business partnerships, longer than many marriages. Because it was built on foundation of genuine respect rather than just pragmatic cooperation. Because both men had proven they would honor agreements even when honoring them meant carrying personal burdens that others would never see. Because trust between them had been tested in ways that revealed character rather than just capability. And one of those tests had been the secret about gay Orlova's truth that Lucky had shared with Bumpy in moment of vulnerability, the promise that Bumpy had made to keep that truth contained, the decades of silence that followed, while both men maintained fiction that Gay had been loyal girlfriend whose suicide was mysterious tragedy, rather than inevitable consequence of guilt she couldn't escape. The third time Bumpy thought seriously about gay Orlova was in January 1962, when news reached Harlem that Lucky Luciano had died of heart attack at Naples airport while meeting American film. Producer died 16 years after his deportation, died at age 64 while still officially exiled from United States, died still believing that Bumpy Johnson had kept the secret about Gay's betrayal because nobody had ever suggested otherwise. Bumpy attended no funeral. Travel to Italy for mob boss's memorial service would have attracted attention that neither Bumpy nor the families wanted, but he marked Lucky's death privately by reflecting on the chess games they'd played, on the arrangement they'd negotiated, on Team 33 years of cooperation that had kept Harlem relatively stable while other territories descended into constant warfare, on the promise he'd made in February 1936 that he'd maintained for 26 years until Lucky's death. And with Lucky dead, Bumpy faced question he'd been avoiding since gay Orlova's suicide. Was the promise to keep her betrayal secret still binding when the person who'd extracted that promise was no longer alive to care whether it was honored? Some men would have said no, that promises die with the people who request them, that there's no obligation to maintain secrets when doing so no longer serves any purpose, that truth should eventually emerge regardless of whether revealing it breaks confidence given decades earlier. Some men would have taken Lucky's death as permission to finally tell the full story about Gay's betrayal, to correct a historical record that portrayed her as innocent bystander rather than as contributor to Lucky's conviction, to provide context that explained why she'd killed herself. Bumpy chose differently. He decided that the promise he'd made to Lucky mattered more after Lucky's death than it had while Lucky was alive, because keeping it now served no strategic purpose, and therefore proved that his word had always been about integrity rather than about what he could gain from Lucky's continued trust. He decided that gay Orlova's legacy, tragic or guilty, romantic figure, or betrayer, victim of circumstances or architect of own destruction, wasn't his responsibility to shape through revelation of truth that Lucky had asked him to conceal. He decided that some secrets are meant to be permanent rather than temporary, are meant to be taken to grave rather than eventually disclosed, are meant to remain between the people who shared them regardless of whether either person is still alive to enforce that silence. Have you ever kept a promise long after the person who extracted it had died? Long after anyone would ever know whether you honored it? Long after keeping it served any purpose except preserving your own sense of integrity that nobody else could verify or validate? Leave a like if you understand that the heaviest promises are the ones nobody else knows about, the secrets nobody else can confirm you kept, the burdens that only you carry without recognition or reward. So Bumpy Johnson maintained his silence about gay Orlova's betrayal. He let historians analyze Lucky Luciano's conviction without knowing that Lucky's girlfriend had been secretly feeding information to prosecutors. He let journalists speculate about Dewey's commutation without understanding that guilt over methods used to obtain conviction had motivated early release. He let Gay's suicide remain mysterious tragedy rather than inevitable consequence of betrayer's guilt. And he carried that knowledge for 6 more years, until his own death In July 1968, 32 years after the chess game where Lucky had confessed the truth, 12 years after Gay's suicide, 6 years after Lucky's death, nobody knew that Bumpy Johnson had kept Lucky Luciano's most painful secret. Nobody knew that Bumpy understood why Gay Orlova had really killed herself. Nobody knew that the alliance between Harlem's Black Godfather and New York's Italian mob boss had been sustained partly by silence about girlfriend who'd betrayed her lover while pretending to be devoted. It wasn't the kind of story that made newspapers, or that got told in mob documentaries, or that became part of the legends that grew up around both Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano after their deaths. It was a quiet story about private suffering that two powerful men had shared and then contained because releasing it would have served nobody's interests and would have violated trust that mattered more than any truth that revelation would have exposed. What made this story remarkable wasn't the betrayal itself. Lots of mob girlfriends betrayed their lovers. Lots of informants provided information that led to convictions. Lots of people killed themselves out of guilt for things they'd done. What made it remarkable was that Lucky had trusted Bumpy enough to reveal the betrayal, despite all the reasons not to, was that Bumpy had honored that trust, despite having every strategic reason to spread information that would have strengthened his own position by weakening Italian mob's moral authority, was that both men had maintained silence about truth that contradicted public narrative everyone else believed. The final time Bumpy Johnson thought about Gay Orlova was in July 1968, the week before his own death, when he was thinking generally about what happens to secrets when the people who keep them die, about whether truths that were concealed for good reasons remain concealed forever or eventually emerge, when nobody alive remembers why concealing them mattered. He thought about how Gay Orlova's real story, not the tragedy of aging showgirl, but the complexity of woman who'd betrayed man she loved for reasons she probably didn't fully understand herself and then couldn't live with. Consequences of that betrayal would likely never be told because everyone who knew the full truth would soon be dead. He thought about how Lucky Luciano's real vulnerability, not the powerful mob boss who got taken down by ambitious prosecutor, but the heartbroken man who'd been destroyed partly by girlfriend who'd seemed devoted, would remain unknown, because acknowledging it would diminish the legend that had grown around Lucky's name. He thought about how Thomas Dewey's real motivation for commuting Lucky's sentence, not the strategic wartime cooperation or the political calculation, but the guilt over methods used to obtain conviction, would be interpreted by historians as pragmatic decision, rather than as moral compromise by prosecutor who understood he'd crossed ethical lines to win case that made his career. All of these truths would die with Bumpy Johnson when he died of heart attack at Wells Restaurant on July 7, 1968, eating his favorite meal of chicken legs and hominy grits, surrounded by friends who had no idea that he'd been carrying secret for years that would reshape understanding of one of organized crime's most famous convictions if it were ever revealed. Mime Johnson, Bumpy's widow, never knew about Gay Orlova's betrayal. Unibird and other close associates never heard the story. Nobody in the Genovese family or in any of the 5 families learned that Lucky Luciano's girlfriend had been informant. Thomas Dewey went to his grave in 1971, never knowing that his conviction of Lucky had depended partly on information from source who'd been motivated by love rather than by law enforcement's investigative work. The secret stayed secret. The promise was kept. The truth remained concealed not because revealing it was impossible, but because honoring commitment made 32 years earlier mattered more than setting historical records straight. That's the real story of Lucky Luciano's mistress, who betrayed the mob and Bumpy Johnson's decision to be the only person who knew the full truth and never revealed it. Not a story about dramatic confrontation or public exposure or revenge. A story about two powerful men sharing painful secret and then protecting that secret for decades because trust mattered more than truth, because promises outlasted circumstances, because silence sometimes serves honor better than revelation. And perhaps that's the most important lesson from this entire story. That the greatest displays of power aren't always the ones everyone sees, that the most significant acts of loyalty aren't always the ones that get recognized, that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to know something important and choose not to tell anyone because you gave your word, that you wouldn't, regardless of whether anyone else would ever know whether you kept that promise. Bumpy Johnson kept that promise. Gay Orlova died with her guilt. Lucky Luciano lived and died, believing his secret was safe. Thomas Dewey never learned the full truth about his most famous conviction, and history recorded only the public versions of events, while the real truth, the complicated, painful, human truth about love and betrayal and guilt and silence remained, known only to man who'd promised to keep it secret and who honored that promise until his dying day. That's what it meant to be Bumpy Johnson. Not just to be powerful enough to control Harlem for 40 years, not just to be respected enough to negotiate with Italian mob as equal, but to be trustworthy enough that Lucky Luciano could confess his deepest vulnerability and know that confession would go no further. To be honorable enough that keeping promise mattered more than strategic advantage that breaking it might have provided. To be strong enough to carry secret burden for 3 decades. Without reward or recognition while everyone else remained ignorant of truth, you alone possessed. The chess game on February 17, 1936, lasted maybe 90 minutes. The promise Bumpy Johnson made during that game lasted the rest of his life. And the secret about gay Orlova's betrayal died with him on July 7, 1968, taking with it the full truth about one of organized crime's most legendary prosecutions, one of its most famous love stories, and one of its least understood suicides. Nobody knows this story now. Nobody can verify whether it's true. Nobody has documentation proving that gay Orlova was informant, or that Lucky confessed it to Bumpy, or that Bumpy kept the secret until his death. This story exists in realm of possibility rather than proof, in space between known facts and plausible speculation, in territory where history becomes legend and legend sometimes preserves truths that documentation can't capture. But whether every detail is accurate or not, the story illustrates something true about the world Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano inhabited. That power depended on trust. That trust depended on honor. That honor sometimes meant keeping secrets that harmed nobody by being kept, and might have harmed everyone by being revealed. That the strongest bonds between people weren't always the ones witnessed by others, but were the private understandings that shaped behavior when nobody else was watching. And perhaps that's enough reason to tell the story. Not because we can prove every element of it, but because it reveals what mattered to men who operated in shadows, and whose legacies depend partly on secrets they kept, promises they honored, and burdens they carried without asking for recognition or reward. Bumpy Johnson was the only one who knew the truth about Lucky Luciano's mistress, who betrayed him. And he took that truth to his grave because his word mattered more than any advantage that breaking it might have provided. That's not the kind of power that makes headlines or gets celebrated in films or becomes part of popular mythology about organized crime, but it's the kind of power that lasts.